Hey, good morning, Redemption. Pastor Scott coming to you and hoping that you had a good week and enjoying your Sunday gathering with other believers in Jesus. I've heard a lot of you are doing brunches together, and that excites me. I will be camping as the number of men who are coming keeps growing, which is exciting. And I'm looking forward to just being with my boys and hanging out with the guys. And we're going to be doing some prayer times and actually reading and going through the book of Philippians. So looking forward for that and thankful to be together. Last Sunday, I did a sermon on prayer and dealing with the attitude of prayer and dealing with issues that in Jesus' day people had, why they were praying for wrong reasons and thinking that with the excess of words that they could work God into giving them what they really wanted, or that they used prayer for their own means and for their own self glory. And you can check that out on the web, on Facebook Live if you missed that. And next Sunday, we're going to actually be looking at the Lord's Prayer. And in between, I thought I would just do something else on prayer and encourage us. I don't know about you, but finding time to pray is probably harder than actually praying itself. It seems like in our day that time and space are two commodities that are very difficult to obtain. Time. Do we have time in our weekly schedules that we could actually pull back and just spend time praying? Now, I'm always been a firm believer that we always make time to do what we want to do. There's always enough time to do what we want to do, and that is very true. There's also another sense that we live in a very busy society, and that's not always bad, but it can lead to some very serious consequences down the road if we don't do that. And so we need to actually begin to make time in our daily schedules for prayer. And in fact, Jesus did this quite regularly. In the book of Luke, it says that at daybreak, Jesus went out to a solitary place, and the people were looking for him. When they came to where he was, they tried to keep him from leaving them. And then just a few verses later, it says, "Yet the news about him spread all the more, that so all the crowds of the people came to hear him and be healed of their sickness. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." Now, Jesus doesn't necessarily have the busy schedules that we have, but we also don't have people chasing us down all the time, saying, "Do this, help me, pray for me, heal me." And it's interesting that in that particular passage, Jesus regularly withdrew to places, to lonely places, to be by himself, to have times of solitude. And I think we need to be people who learn to implement rhythms into our life whereby we can get lonely spaces, that we can, in a sense, not be like Jesus, because we can't be Jesus, but in a sense, model or follow after Jesus's model and withdraw to get some alone time, to get some time of solitude, to get some time of prayer. Jesus continues his ministry, and the gospel writers write this in another instance. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. But the crowds learned about it and followed him. He welcomed them, spoke to them about the kingdom of God, and healed all those who needed healing. So again, we get another picture from a very different author, but dealing with the same particular issues, that Jesus would try to get away. But notice this time, who did he get away with? If you notice in that passage, it says Jesus tried to get away with his disciples. So there are times that we should be withdrawing from our everyday life, not just to be alone in solitude, but to find solitude with God's people. And this is what we do when we gather in missional communities. But I also want to say that we need to build other rhythms into our life where we are meeting with God's people specifically to pray. I love all the things that our MCs are doing right now as I hear meals and people sharing stories and people getting to know each other and serve. And even I this week have had the opportunity to be at PIN, People in Need Ministry in Virginia Beach, and teach on the story of God and inviting people from my MC to meet them. And we're going to be serving them in the coming weeks even more as the days unfold. But it's those things are all important, but I want to ask, do we get together in our MCs and pray? And I want to encourage us to be people who withdraw and make time to pray. And maybe you have an important decision coming up. Maybe you have an important event coming up. We read in the Gospels as well that Jesus says this: one of those days Jesus went to a mountainside to pray. He withdrew. He spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. So in this passage, we actually see that Jesus had a really important task the next day of choosing 12 men. And before he actually chooses these 12 men, before this important task of who are going to be the people who follow him, he commits time to prayer. So sometimes life happens and we don't know what's coming, but there's other times we know that there's major events taking place and coming, and we should be people who withdraw and pray and see what God will actually do. And the last time this is not the last time that Jesus withdraws and prays, but the last example I want to talk to us about this morning is the Lord's Supper. This is a particular time where Jesus withdraws from his ministry. He purposefully gets together and is eating a meal. He's getting together with his disciples. They are singing, they're praying, they're sharing in community. Jesus is inviting them into what he is about to experience and undergo in the next couple days. And so in this passage, we see Jesus withdrawing with his people, with his disciples, not just for prayer, but for a meal, for singing, for community, for transfer of information. And so this is, again, a lot of what we do in our MCs. But again, the issue is time and space. Do we make the time and space necessary to be people who find solitude, people who withdraw, and not just withdraw by ourselves, but at other times withdraw with God's people, invite them into times of prayer, withdraw with God's people into times of fellowship and community and singing and prayer. See, I think this serves as a backbone for Jesus' ministry. It's almost as if he couldn't get through his ministry without these times of withdrawal. Now, all of you introverts are probably giving me a high five, right? And all of you extroverts are like, yeah, I love to get with God's people. I don't want to be alone. And for me, this is not necessarily an introverted or extroverted. If we're extroverted, we need to be alone with God. If we're introverted, we need to be with God's people. And there's no magic number or percentage or, if I'm an introvert, do I got to be 50% alone and 50% with God's people? I'm not going to answer that for you. But what I am going to say is that what Jesus is inviting us into is getting away from the busyness of life, getting away from the crazy, chaotic society that we find ourselves in, and finding times and finding spaces in our day, in our week, to withdraw, to be alone with God, to commune with him, to pray with him. But we also find times to withdraw with God's people. And so I want to just continue to encourage us to be people who make those times in those spaces to do those exact things. That when we gather in our missional communities, that we are withdrawing for community, for prayer, for singing, for meals. And as we close up our time this morning, I just want to maybe encourage us that we be people that as MCs, we would be MCs who actually pray that God would actually use us to bring people into darkness, out of darkness into light. That we would actually experience more and more conversions and see more and more baptisms. So will you take time in the coming weeks as you gather MCs to withdraw from the chaos of life and to enter into the presence of God with God's people and by yourself and just pray? Well, looking forward to being back together next week and going through the Lord's Prayer. Hope you're having a great weekend and a good time in fellowship and encouragement with your MCs and God's people this weekend. The Lord bless you. Have a great day.